Hi everyone, welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the noontime GoLocal Live. We are kicking off today with a special guest. Maria LaRosa with the Weather Channel down in Atlanta is joining us to give us an update on Hurricane Florence. Maria, how are you today?
Doing okay. Busy here at the headquarters, of course.
So have to let folks know you've got the Rhode Island connection, siblings at URI up here, and we're going to tack as to what this weather pattern might hold for New England. But in the meantime, let's talk about what we're seeing as we speak.
Okay, the latest advisory was 11 a.m. and as you know, it came ashore early this morning, 7:15 at Wrightsville Beach as a Category 1 storm, max winds at 90 miles per hour. The latest update, 11 a.m., now has sustained winds at 80 miles per hour. But the key is that it has slowed down, continues to move at a snail's pace, and that's going to be huge when we talk about the major impact that we're most concerned about, and that is the rainfall and the river flooding. We've already seen reports over a foot of rain. There will be places that are threatening North Carolina's state rain record, which is 24.06 inches of rain, which came along with Floyd in 1999. That says a lot. A lot of people are thinking back to Matthew as well. We could have the Cape Fear River and the Lumber River crest higher than they did during Matthew just 2 years ago. So that is going to be the focus with the forecast of this storm. And to put in perspective, it's only the center of it, forecast only to make it to the upstate of South Carolina by Sunday morning. So that is what's going to lead to some incredible rainfall totals. And another side note too, with it moving so slowly, there are still a lot of places along the North Carolina coast that are seeing that push of water, that surge. So a couple more tide cycles on that side, places like Cape Fear, some of the Outer Banks still have some high water potential. And then when the winds shift in places like Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, that'll be a concern for them.
So question for you, Maria. Excuse me here. How is it that it stalls? What's the weather that the weather pattern that basically contributes to the stalling of the storm itself?
You know, we think of these systems as massive, forward motion machines, but they're really just dense fluids moving within a fluid and at the mercy of all the other systems. So what we have with Florence, it was being guided to the coast with a very strong high pressure. So that kept it on that west-northwest track. Well, now we have a weaker high pressure and very little steering flow around it. So there's nothing to kind of get it going. And so that's why it is going to be moving so slowly. It's really not until early next week that we get sort of that jet stream to help us out a little bit and get it kicking to the north and east, which then for you guys means you may feel some of that tropical environment, some of that rainfall as we get from Tuesday to Wednesday.
And so when it was approaching the Carolinas, Maria, clearly a lot of talk about just the size and scope of it being the size of Michigan. I'm surprised I didn't use Rhode Island, but clearly bigger because now we're getting into a bigger state territory. What happens? Is it that expansive still? Obviously when it hits land, that slows it. But is it still that big in size and scope?
It is still a huge system. As of the latest advisory, those tropical storm force winds extend 195 miles out from the center. So you're talking 300-400 mile wide stretch experiencing tropical storm force winds, with the hurricane force winds still in that 75 to 80 mile out from the center range. So there's still a lot of mileage coverage from this system. So all the way from South Carolina to almost the Virginia border right now, experiencing those tropical storm force winds. And what's interesting is that, it does come ashore, it does, weaken. We say weaken, but it still has a lot of other powers to it. Those winds spread out. So you may see the core of the system weaken, from 90 to 80, but the forceful winds, tropical storm to hurricane force, that influence, that radius stretches out. So that's always a concern too after landfall.
And so I appreciate your giving us the heads up as to what's taking place down there and what we can possibly expect up here. Now, as you said, it's going to be a depression when it hits Rhode Island, but can we expect significant rain up here?
Significant in some ways, yes, several inches. The forecast right now, you're looking at this adding maybe 2 or 3 inches of rainfall in parts of New England, touching on Rhode Island specifically. And that may not seem like a lot because of the numbers that we're dealing with right now. You hear, 20 inches of rain, you're thinking, oh, 2 to 3 inches of rain, not a big deal. That's sufficient to create some problems. So I don't want to alarm anyone, just alert that you may see some flash flooding. There are some areas in the Northeast and New England that have really saturated ground, and so this is going to be an issue, adding water to the river systems and that are already kind of taxed at this point with water.
Well, Maria, I appreciate your taking the time to give us the lay of the land, so to speak, as all eyes are down there, and our thoughts and prayers are with folks to stay safe. So we appreciate your time. Maria LaRosa with the Weather Channel. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to speak with you soon.
All right, thank you, Kate.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Don't go anywhere. I want to thank Maria LaRosa with the Weather Channel for checking in. We're going to be right back with former State Representative and Deputy Secretary of State Ray Rickman for his Big View.
I'm Ray Rickman, and I'd like to talk about a persistent, ongoing problem that gets worse. School children in Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket are getting horrible education. So in Providence, Latino children are measured. There are 350 school districts in America that they look at. And the Latino children in Providence receive the 350th worst education in this country. Can I repeat this? Out of 350 school districts, they receive the 350th worst. Now, I'd like to know where the alarm buttons are going off. Why we're not having an emergency summit. And I'm not talking about a charrette where we sit around and talk to educators. I'm talking about when are we going to change what is happening? We have a superintendent in Providence. They gave him a 1-year extension because he didn't merit a 3-year extension because the school district's so bad. Now, I'm trying to figure out if you're not worthy of a 3-year, how do you get a 1-year? Why don't we bring someone in to this emergency condition to see if we could at least stabilize it? Remember, I told you, we just keep going downhill every single year. And so possibly we'll go downhill another year with this superintendent. This is not fair to the children of Providence. Now, what else would I see? I'd like to, one of the problems is, I'm not blaming this all on the superintendent. Maybe the superintendent gets 10% of the blame. Superintendent wasn't here 3 years ago. So who's to blame? Well, when I was a kid, a 7, 8-year-old in Detroit system, the teachers were 99% white. The parents all of a sudden were 50% black. And the parents would show up to talk to the teachers, and the language wasn't the same. The teachers weren't used to black folks coming to school to make, you make demands for your children. Can my child have this? Can my child do this? Can my child sit closer to the window? Whatever you want, little, medium, or big, whatever. In Detroit, they told me I needed to take French. I didn't want to take French. The reason I need to take French is because it's the language of the world. And I can remember my mother saying, well, I keep seeing all these new people showing up, and they're all Latino. They're all speaking Spanish. Shouldn't my son learn Spanish? And they said to my mother, no, I'm the educator here. I'll decide what your child learns. Are you listening? And they were dead wrong. Dead, dead, dead wrong. I would be so better off if I spoke Spanish instead of the little French I speak. So, teachers not always right. The educational system's not always right. They may need input from parents, from the wider community, from a strengthened school board, for a mayor who actually pays attention. What I'd like to see in the coming year, literally, is a mayor who meets monthly with the school board and the teachers union, that they create a parents' council with some authority and some power, citywide parents' council. We have an emergency going on, and no one has the fire alarm out. Please.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the noontime show today. Obviously a lot of focus on Hurricane Florence as all eyes are on the Carolinas. I want to thank Maria LaRosa from the Weather Channel for Skyping in. Now we get the environmental and public policy perspective. Chad McGuire is a professor of public policy with a focus on environmental policy at UMass Dartmouth. Chad, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we just got the weather forecast, and I'm glad that we can have you join us because really want to sort of talk about the public policy side of things, both from preparing for hurricanes and their aftermath. So introduce yourself to viewers a little bit, Chad, and tell us a little bit about your hurricane research, and then we'll go on about this hurricane and more.
Yeah, so My research really looks at the intersection of what government does before things like natural disasters like hurricanes happen, what they do to help prepare us both in terms of dealing with the actual event and maybe even preparing us so that we avoid some of the worst consequences of those events. So my research looks at that, what government does beforehand, during, and then after these events. So I kind of look at it in a time perspective, and I focus very much on what government, the actions government actually takes in terms of its planning, but also some of the laws that we have in place. I have a legal background, so I look at those laws and I see how those laws interact with some of the policies. And sometimes they interact quite well, they run parallel to each other, and sometimes they're somewhat contradictory in how they play out.
So talk with a little bit about that. What are some of these contradictions that you've seen?
So, I mean, generally speaking, and it makes sense if you think about it, we as a society don't want most of our society living in dangerous areas. A silly example is I don't think anybody is interested at living on the edge, the very top of an active volcano, right? I don't think anybody wants to have their property located there. Mm-hmm. Because it's dangerous, it's active, and it's obvious. There's real immediate danger. You know, as we as a society historically, and we live here in New England, you know, a lot of the development that happened in New England is a direct consequence of how we settled this area of the country. You know, we came on boats, we got to the coastline, and we started living in those
just set up shop right on the water.
Right, and we know that. We see that in Boston and, you know, so on and so forth. And, you know, a lot of people don't realize, and certainly in Providence and many other areas along the eastern seaboard. And because of that, you know, we sort of had this historical dependence. You know, we didn't start living on top of volcanoes, that's obvious, right? But we started living in these coastal areas, and most of these areas are very low-lying. As a matter of fact, if you look at a very old map of Boston, you'll see that what actually we see Boston today is about 50 to 60% of it is fill.
Yes.
This area that used to be water, and we've actually filled it. Like Back Bay, for example, is called Back Bay for a good reason, because it used to be a bay.
Yes.
And the only reason I say that is because if we think about it, we live very close to the water. We don't live up high like you think of the cliffs of Dover in England, for example, right? You know, where you're thinking that, you know, you live very far above. You're very close to the water, but you live very far above it. Here we live very close to the water. And, of course, we know in New England, nor'easters, we have special conditions here that allow for these types of storms to sort of sit on us, not unlike what's happening right now down in North and South Carolina, sort of sit along the coastline, re-energize themselves and put a lot of energy, you know, re-energize in the ocean, get some more energy from the water, the warmth in the water itself, moisture, and then be able to deposit that on the land, which makes it especially, relatively speaking, dangerous. So, you know, what I'm saying is that we sort of have historically decided to live in areas that have some degree of inherent danger. If we add on top of that this idea of climate change and this notion of, you know, our sea levels are increasing, and this has been shown, right, where we're actually in our area of the Atlantic, we're, you know, increasing at a rate that's about as high as we've seen globally. So with the increase in sea level rise, even though it's not significant on an annual basis or even a decadal basis, it's not a lot of sea level rise. It is not in the terms of like a foot of sea level rise in the sort of near term. It has the capacity to really move that water over this very low-lying land, very far inland, and cause substantial damage when you couple the idea of an increasing sea level with increasing intensity and frequency of storms.
So let's talk a little bit on the flip side, the recovery process, and how states and communities are approaching it now in this current day and age, and how they had in the past, Chad. You know, each situation is unique. New Orleans, Harvey, even New York's response to Sandy. You know, from your perspective, in the past, did communities, you know, really sort of buckle in from the resiliency standpoint and say, well, we're just going to rebuild here? But now states and cities and towns are really taking a look at those hard-hit areas and saying it makes zero sense to do so. And what are the public policy implications at play with basically just not even the cleanup process, but the sort of the wholesale moving of communities into other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think government, you know, historically, started with the notion of we're just going to help out, and it was very responsive. It wasn't very proactive. It was always after the event, and we know that today we call it disaster relief, which actually has a political connotation to it, right? It's a once you've been declared a disaster, there's a bunch of mechanisms, including financial mechanisms, that open up, taxpayer dollars, money from the federal government to help to sort of deal with the situation. And again, historically, we've been very reactive in our approach. We would just simply come in and help to, and if you remember Governor Christie at the time in 2012 down in New Jersey, you mentioned Superstorm Sandy, you know, walking with President Obama at the time and saying, we will rebuild. That's a mantra. It's a very important mantra culturally that we've inherited.
But is it practical?
Right. So that's historical, and we still continue that today to a degree where we look to remediation. We look to government coming in and stepping in to help make everything okay. One of the problems that we've had is that government, again, historically, has incentivized us living in these coastal areas. It's helped to provide financing for infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, you know, the things that are necessary to really develop communities. It's made it low cost. The fact that we have now today an insurance program, and flood insurance program, that's simply public. It's run by the federal government, and historically the federal government has offered that program at significantly reduced rates, meaning that if you were trying to get private flood insurance from a private insurance company, they charge you a much higher premium, what's called an actuarial rate. All of those things have told people that, look, it's not very risky to live along the coast, and the way that people identify that is, you know, when you go to buy a house on the coastline around here, you ask the realtor, you know, does it have, you know, flood insurance? And they say, yeah, you know, maybe it's required here, but then the realtor says, but it's only $500 a year. And I think the average citizen looks at that and says, $500, that's less than my homeowner's insurance, that's way less than my property taxes, that's just not a lot of risk, so no problem. So my point is that we've done a lot of things that have incentivized people to live in relatively risky areas. We're now looking, if you look at reports, Boston has a Green Ribbon Commission, issued a report a couple of years ago that started looking at proactive measures. And of course, at the federal level, that means some difficult choices about stopping to incentivize infrastructure, the building of infrastructure. I think you mentioned earlier quickly that after Superstorm Sandy in New York City, the government decided to do some buyouts instead of rebuilding in certain areas, very low-lying areas. So these were homes that were destroyed during Sandy, where they decided to simply purchase the land and take it away from development. That's been kind of iffy. They've kind of moved back from that to some degree. And, you know, we exist in this world where there's ongoing pressures. There's pressures for people, they desire to live along coastal areas. There's high demand, and when, you know, the real estate market's doing well and you're in an area of high demand like New York City, where there's limited real estate, often you find that those incentives can somehow, you know, they take over when events like these hurricanes don't happen, every so often. If they're not happening every year, the public kind of sort of, you know, the desire to have government do something proactively sort of, you know, ebbs.
Dissipates, not the flow, certainly the ebb. So we've seen that here in actually Cranston, for instance, in Rhode Island, some buybacks from houses along low-lying river areas that have been prone to excessive flooding. The city stepped in and said, look, these have to go. And what was the pushback and the reticence after New York really took that? As I know you mentioned the ebb and flow, but they had initially taken that big step and said, okay, we're just going to take these off. What were the set of circumstances?
So, you know, after Superstorm Sandy, there was an area, low-lying areas along the Hudson, where they were sort of, the city basically effectively gave the rights to development to the state, and basically, you know, like open space here, just said, hey, state, take ownership of this and keep it as open space, so that we have this buffer zone. We're going to create the buffer zone that we might not have right now. And that worked out fine. But a few years later, 2015, 2016, you know, as you know, we're in an economic recovery from the Great Recession. Things are going well, real estate values are increasing, and it's getting tight. You know, there's a lot of demand for property along those areas. And of course, this is an area that's highly desirable. It's, you know, it's right near the river, that sort of thing. So the city has requested from the state to give that land back for development purposes. And so I think that's just an example. You can follow that in the news. The New York Times has reported on this pretty well over the years. And again, so you see that kind of, in policy they might talk, they call it, when the public becomes focused on an event, you have what's called a focusing event. So you have something happen. It might be tragic. It might be a hurricane like this, and everybody gets focused in the moment. And that's where you have what's called windows of opportunity. You can actually do something politically that otherwise you might not be able to do. But if that event goes away, maybe some of the public support for it goes away as well.
Then they forget as well. And let's talk a little bit about that, and we'll use the New York example. We see when hurricanes hit, the proximity to the storm and the proximity to the water body, most governmental agencies require evacuations. Is there any way to require, especially let's look at the New York case, kind of a smart rebuild? I'm not saying it's going to look like the Outer Banks, sort of up on the 10-foot pylons there, but is that feasible, and is that something that needs to be considered?
Yeah, so I'm sorry. Yeah, to go back to an earlier part of our discussion, what governments are doing now better today is they're thinking more proactively. And I think your example there is that. It's building standards, right? Setback requirements, freeboard they call it. Sometimes you see that where the home is built actually on stilts, whether concrete stilts or things like that. And so and there's all kinds of other land use tools, rolling easements, sort of instead of a 30-foot setback, it's a 30-year setback based on sea level rise, the anticipated rise of the ocean, so there's many ways you can incorporate a proactive approach in a sort of land use planning perspective, and those are all really good examples. And I know the federal government now for a number of years has gotten out of the business of providing, zero interest and guarantees and assurities for infrastructure development, the sewers, the lines, that sort of thing, the electric, the grid, in these sensitive areas. So what they're trying to do in that way is say, look, if you're going to develop, the state is going to allow development in a sensitive coastal area, either the private developer or the county or the local government is going to have to flip the bill, right? If the federal government is out of the business of making it easier to do that. So those are all proactive measures.
And let's talk a little bit on the policy side of things. As we're watching Florence and any hurricane that takes place around the country, there's the individuals that evacuate and then there are ones that stay. How much of a cost is it for communities when they literally have to go and rescue folks who have decided to try to ride out the storm for any number of circumstances, but at the opposition to what they've been told by elected officials?
Yeah, I think, I'm not an economist, but I think most economists agree that storm events like this are all cost. And we're not talking simply about human lives, but if you look at, there's always been some anecdotal argument that, when you have a storm like this, there's a lot of rebuilding that happens, and that can spur economic activity. And that's true for certain places, for certain businesses.
But that doesn't offset the cost of the storm by any stretch of the imagination.
No, it doesn't even come close, and that's right. And so I think what you're identifying, at least in my opinion, is additional costs. So there's cost to human life, there's cost to human safety, there's cost to what it takes for those, not only the people that have chosen to stay that need to be rescued, but of course the first responders, those individuals that are putting their lives at risk. We see this, in California, the firefighters, for example, right? I mean, it's not only the cost to the actual the devastation of the natural resources during the fire, for example, but it's the cost of those responders that have to try to, mitigate the effects of it.
And when we see those numbers, Chad, are any time opportunity costs incorporated in there as well? The number of businesses that lose business days, do we ever see those numbers played out?
I mean, so to do an accurate accounting, right, you'd want to list all of the costs against all of the benefits. You don't want to cherry pick, right? And that's exactly right. So there's significant delay. There's loss in business opportunity. There's all kinds. There are all kinds of additional costs. I mean, there's people feel uncertain about the area for a period of time. There's lack of investment for those reasons from that perspective. Yeah. I mean, if it's an area like New Orleans, actually, there's been studies on this. After Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans was already in a strong state of development. It was on the rise, so to speak, from an economic development perspective. And after Katrina, there were certainly costs, without a doubt. And I don't even know if the population today, right, has returned to what the population was. But we know for a very long time that population was significantly less So all of those things are real costs that are incurred in areas, even areas that are considered viable and areas in demand where people want to move to otherwise, right, want to be around.
So before we let you go, Chad, you know, we were able to, again, talk with the Weather Channel from the forecast perspective, but from your public policy perspective, what are you keeping an eye on in terms of Florence and how its interaction with government?
So it's going to be interesting to see the political response. One of the most difficult things that I think we have to overcome as a nation is we culturally think of land as something that's static. That's just sort of inert, you know, like undeveloped land. We just see it and it doesn't change, and we can count on it to always be that way. And I think we have to shift our thinking, at least in terms of these natural disasters, from land being something that's static to something that's an active thing. It's constantly in change. And it's going to be interesting to see how the government chooses to respond. The political incentives are clear. The studies that have been done on this are quite clear. When the government comes in and distributes financial money directly to the people who have suffered loss, and that's mostly in redevelopment, you know, and small business loans and all kinds of other things, they win votes by doing that. It's very costly for them to do that, but they win votes that way. So it's going to be interesting to see how the politicians and how government choose to respond to this.
Yes.
In terms of, are they going to dole out a lot of, you know, a lot of sort of, you know, after the fact benefits and not think about the proactive aspects that we were talking about earlier.
Well, it's certainly a tug and pull, and clearly there's a lot of human toll at stake, but as you mentioned, economic one as well. And we appreciate being able to pick your brain as we're all focused on the weather to get sort of the response side of things and what to look at moving forward. So Chad McGuire at UMass Dartmouth, thank you so much for taking the time to Skype in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks, Chad. We'll let Chad go, and we'll be right back. Navigant Credit Union. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. I'd like to welcome my next guest, familiar face, GoLocal columnist Bob Wickham.
How are you?
Thanks for joining us. Before we talk to politics, which now seems like eons ago, I do want to talk about what's in the news and some discussions we've had today. Just spoke with Chad McGuire at UMass Dartmouth.
Terrific, great
I want to thank you for telling me to reach out to him.
Absolutely. I think what we're getting another reminder of here is the craziness of our coastal development rules or lack of rules, where we constantly pay through public and private money for people to rebuild where they shouldn't be rebuilding. And we're seeing this again, and we're seeing this in North Carolina. By the way, the federal flood insurance program was $20 billion in debt before Florence.
Oh, goodness.
So given the amount of development in that part of, you've been down there, but that part of North Carolina and Myrtle Beach and so on, it's going to be pretty bad. The storm did weaken, but the area is very broad. They're going to get, I don't know, 20 or 30 inches rain someplace, so there'll be tremendous inland destruction too, and people with their houses along the river.
So he mentioned the need for political, basically courage, if you will, that after a storm, because let's face it, it's, you know, people are watching, there's human suffering, there's a human toll.
There's a lot of drama. That's why cable television loves these storms.
There is, I mean, it's Hurricane Florence 24/7 right now, and for that part of the country, no two ways about it. You know, it is under siege. But, you know, will there come a time when politicians say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to give you money to rebuild here. We really need to think about this in a much more...
Very difficult, partly because of campaign contributors,
Yep.
partly because the nature of the people live along the coast. A lot of rich people, they give money to political campaigns. In the case of the Republicans, of course, most of these people tend to be Republicans. And you've got the real estate developers, you've got the real estate agents, huge economic force. And it's very difficult all over the country, not only in red states, but in New England too, to push back against that. I mean, people are building stuff in South County, in Rhode Island, they shouldn't be built. I think GoLocal has had some stuff on that, you know, building these McMansions basically on the dunes. And what will it take? Oh, probably a broader, you know, fiscal collapse.
Well, it's interesting because we were talking about the New York example.
And a loss of life. I interrupt. The other thing is people rebuilding, and then they're in the house or wherever. The storm comes in, they drown, and then people start to ask, maybe really people shouldn't be there at all. Anyway.
Well, we were talking about New York, and Chad mentioned sort of the buyback program right after Sandy. Now they look like they're going to redevelop it again.
Along the Hudson.
Along the Hudson. But here in Cranston, you know, I don't know if this, I'm assuming it's the city's purview, not the state's, but they bought back a number of houses
along the Patuxent River,
that have
which floods,
continually
which
flood.
I remember it was in 2011, it looked like the Mississippi.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you know, there was some foresight, at least in Cranston, to do so. So we'll continue to keep an eye on Florence. We're supposed to get some rain potentially next week as a small depression. It's heading inland, and it's not really coming up.
I don't see any embrace of reality anytime soon with this. Just the economic and the sort of the cultural factors encouraging people to be on near water just continue very strong.
Well, had to start with Florence because that's sort of top of the news cycle today. But of course, the primaries this week.
Right. Yeah, which does seem like 14 years ago. Yeah. A couple of things that struck me was kind of almost paradoxical. And I'm looking at the New York stuff too, where Como went very, for the big jobs, the big statewide jobs. The sort of establishment Democrats did perfectly well.
Held serve.
The Truman, you know, the Truman Democrats, old-fashioned, kind of middle-of-the-road Democrats, slightly left of center. But in the legislative races, this may be explained by the intensity of the progressives' passion in some of these races. The progressives did pretty well. I'm not sure about New York. I haven't seen all the numbers for the New York legislative races, but certainly Rhode Island, the progressives did well, which leads me to another speculation, which in the next session, Speaker Mattiello may well be out. It's just the fatigue, you know, speaker fatigue. And maybe some people blame him for the Paw Sox thing, but I really don't think so. I don't think there's nearly as much interest in the Paw Sox.
Well, we've seen Moira Walsh has gone after him vociferously since turning back his candidate there.
But I think what you could see with the progressives taking up more space, more oxygen to the Democratic Party there, and then just this sort of speaker fatigue. I think we may well have a new House Speaker next year.
We shall see. And you raised the interesting point about the progressives at the local level versus the state. We had the story in GoLocal the day following a progressive leader at the Providence Student Union. Basically took folks to task to jumping on Matt Brown's campaign at the expense of, it was the infighting amongst the left. It was interesting to see. It comes down to there's finite resources, right? The Republicans are always talking about, the voter turnout on the Republican primary. But when you talk about the progressive faction, there's only so many progressives, and granted, the party's growing.
Interesting thing, the people who vote in primaries, both the Republicans and the Democrats, tend to be more committed. But there is this sort of paradox. Again, you're all looking at the same ballots, basically, and yet they're voting for Gina Raimondo and not Matt Brown, who's positioning himself on the left. And I was a little surprised. I thought, given Gina's incumbency, and she's had some successes, I thought she'd probably win, but I thought he had a chance of doing an upset, of staging an upset. I thought he'd do better than he did, but I think some people saw they didn't trust him. They thought he sort of reappeared from the mist of history, and thought maybe he was a little bit
The
opportunistic.
Zach Mazzara with the Providence student, you called him the random dude, and
Yeah, right,
someone
yeah.
was like, "Well, he was I'll tell
Yeah,
you,
he
I'll
sort
tell
of
you
came
this."
in
When
and-
people said, "Oh, but he was Secretary of State in '06," think about the youth.
Oh, yeah.
Think about the youth
It's
of the
ancient
progressive.
history.
They're like,
Oh,
he
yeah,
wasn't our
that's
Secretary
up
of
to
State.
Paleolithic time.
I was in high school. I'm talking about the
That's right.
20-somethings
Yeah,
that say,
I mean,
I don't
yeah.
remember him.
Yeah,
He wasn't.
I remember nothing. I know nothing. But I was surprised because he was in many ways, he is a better candidate than Gina Raimondo in terms of public presentation. He's got some charisma. He speaks well. He's very articulate. I thought he would do better. That rather surprised me.
Were you surprised by the snafu out of the Raimondo campaign that they had some Providence imagery where they were taking...
That was great. I love that. Right. It was actually shots of downtown Reykjavik. That's right, where they identified the crumbling infrastructure of Cranston was actually in Providence.
I know it was right along the line there.
Right,
A
right
lot of
along the
folks,
line,
again, just
yeah.
point to that cooler, warmer snafu.
And they should push back, John. They should, what a silly screw up. That's what everybody should say. Oh, okay, I screwed up. Everybody makes mistakes going to the next thing, but with a cooler,
It's not the
warmer
crime.
thing.
It's not the crime. It's
Yeah.
the cover-up. I
It's the
believe
cover-up, right.
they're taking that piece out of
right.
the spot there. But
Yeah.
let's just talk about the essence of the
Yeah.
spot in itself. Cranston's oftentimes on those lists of best cities to live
Yeah.
and best communities. So
Yeah.
do you think Cranston's a distressed city?
Well, I think parts of it are gritty, obviously. I mean, it is an old city. It's got 90 or 100,000 people, and it used to be a manufacturing city. But mostly, I think it's pretty well kept up. I mean, it's in a sense, it's 2 or 3 cities: the area along the bay, and then the western Cranston, which is Exurbia with McMansions, and the area in between. But when you look overall, they have pretty good city services. The schools are pretty good, among the better ones in the state. And I think it's generally considered a pretty well-run place, has been under Democratic and Republican mayors. And I think the Mayor Fung has done a good job. I mean, he's not a visionary by any means, but he's done a competent job. The city seems to be doing pretty well. So I think the governor will have some trouble going
with that
after him on
argument.
that. Yeah.
Speaking of mayors and speaking of elections, election night, WPRI 12 did erroneously call the winner of the Cumberland mayoral Democratic primary. Quickly issued a correction. I think the lead to when we had reported on this is there's multiple races on election day.
That's
it's
right.
not just candidates.
It's a mess.
It's
That's
the
right.
media, and the
It's the
media wants
media.
to provide information
That's
first.
right. The media is running for office too, in a sense.
That's
right.
that the media race
Jumping
to
the
call
gun,
things.
right.
I believe we were first to call Gina Raimondo, but you know.
were, so far as I know, and I looked around.
So is
And I've been paid to say that either.
No, he's not paid to say that. Back when Murphy York was originally dubbed the winner back in the day, does that just show sort of the crazy media world in which we're in?
It's much more of a jumble. I think around here, when you just had the Providence Journal, basically, sort of 1 or 2 TVs, Channel 10, but basically the Providence Journal did all this stuff.
Yep.
And they were affiliated with the National Election Service. It was all very orderly.
And they could call it when they called
They would
it.
call it, and of course, before the internet, so you're basically, before, say, 1990, they would rather carefully, and I worked there a couple of times, before, they would be very, very careful before calling anything. And if they didn't know it by press time, they would say they didn't know it, that they didn't have complete results.
Well, it's an
If it's too
interesting.
close to call, there might be a recount. Whatever.
History does repeat itself.
Yeah,
we did report on this
absolutely.
here.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at moving forward for this weekend?
Yeah, obviously there's that. I talked, we've already a federal flood insurance thing. I thought it was amusing. The president says he's trying to block federal employees from getting a pay raise of about 2%. The reason he's giving is because of the parlous state of the federal finances. This is after a huge tax cut.
Right.
So I thought that was sort of entertaining.
Well, you
It
gotta
goes from there. No, we can't possibly responsibly
take from
do
Peter to
this.
pay Paul.
And then we've given the biggest tax cuts basically in history, or among the biggest ones in history. And I say something about, this is kind of a happy thing. You've probably seen this around. There's a bug, a fly, which kills the moths that kill the trees.
Okay.
I think this is an upbeat thing.
Should this be the new state bug?
Yeah, right. It's some kind of fly. This is sort of biocentric stuff. Instead of using pesticides. So So there's actually happy news.
Like that?
Yeah, that's happy news.
We like happy news.
Yeah, and something else, I think I don't have time this week to write about it, but of course the gas explosions up on the North Shore. Apparently the reason is the pipes are very old, they're corroding, and they're pumping a lot of gas through that, maybe too much, more than the corroded pipes can take. And I think this is an example of our, crumbling infrastructure.
Aging infrastructure. Wow, that was
aging infrastructure.
Unbelievable up there. And it's to say, I mean, it could happen anywhere.
Yeah.
It's a very scary thought.
Well, I think maybe a little bit more so in old parts of the country.
Well, here, meaning New England, like could have.
I mean, I don't know when those pipes were installed, and the governor, everybody else in Boston is trying to find out what happened. But
so maybe this week or maybe next week you'll write about that?
Yeah, probably next week. Can I put in? I also put in a pitch for a book about seabirds by Adam Nicholson, which is about the eerie beauty of 10 species of seabirds and how many of them are under stress, endangered.
Well, always appreciate when you get the environmental and literary aspects in there as
very
well.
New England.
It is very New England.
Very New England.
Bob Wickham's very New England.
Well,
Thank you as always for coming, and Bob, we'll let you on your way down to southern pastures, and we'll be right back here.
Tropical Newport.
We'll be back with our next guest in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for the noontime show. Just prior, Carolyn Medeiros with the Alliance for Safe Communities, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kate.
Was at an event calling for Catholic Bishop Thomas Tobin to step down. Now talk with us about organizing this event and your concerns about Bishop Tobin.
Well, it was an event, just not the Alliance, but many Catholics, which they went under the title The Faithful. Catholics throughout the state are disturbed and they're saddened by what's been happening. I want to commend GoLocal Pro for the coverage you've done and the insight and the facts that you've published, which I haven't seen in local media, but you guys have done a really good job, so that's why I came for the interview. You know, we're very concerned. Bishop Tobin, in terms of the Pittsburgh thing, he came out and said he was an auxiliary bishop. He was aware of complaints, but it wasn't his responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility, Kate, when there's child sexual abuse to report it. If it had been a teacher, she would have lost her job. If it had been an emergency care worker in a hospital, they would have lost their job. Even a janitor, you know, morally and ethically, you need to report it. So he failed in that respect, I'm sorry. As a bishop and as a man in the face of humanity to protect our children from a most egregious crime. But then later on he says that there's really been no problems in the last 60 years, and that's just not true. From 1970 to 2006, in 2007, the Supreme Court in Rhode Island forced him to submit 100,000 pages of documents in sexual abuse in the clergy in the diocese in Providence in Rhode Island. That's a problem. That's not a problem, it's a problem. And then in 2016, Survivor Network of Those Abused by Priests, a national nonprofit that the Alliance works with, confronted with press releases asking for him to release the names of 95 priests who are suspected of engaging in, sexual misconduct with children. There are 30 bishops across the country that are producing the names of clergy that are involved in this and putting it on their websites, but he refuses to do it. And it just goes with what seems to be his lack of transparency, obstruction type attitude, and frankly, he hasn't been very kind in speaking to the flock when he tells us to be quiet and just pray, and he goes on Twitter and he says, well, if you do want to go to another church, go, but you're not going to be happy there either. That's hardly a shepherd's word.
Isn't he off Twitter now? Didn't he finally?
He took himself off because apparently that was a conduit to him saying things he can't control, which is sad, and then he does a day of fast today. First he said it was because of his failings and what those bad priests did, but then he changed his story with Channel 12 and said, no, it's just because of what those bad priests did. Either way, it's sad. And the fact that he thinks that he can decide what his penance will be for his acts or lack of actions makes it even sadder.
And also there's the interplay of politics and religion. There have been events up at the State House, a number of legislators about the statute of limitations on sexual abuse here in Rhode Island. End of the session, the legislation did not move. They had events throughout the summer. And certain folks in that community as well, again, calling for the resignation because basically calling out the Catholic Church for blocking it from a lobbyist standpoint. At 7 years it's at right now. The legislators want to be on par with Mass, which is, I believe, 30 of the age of
Pittsburgh
adulthood.
as well. It's 30 for civil and 50 for felony.
So the question is why is it being kept at 7?
Well, it seems pretty enabling to me. It goes along with why are you fighting a Supreme Court judge and saying I'll give you the documents, but they're not going to help you anyway, and there's 100,000 pages. Why are you saying that we have no problems going on? This was 60 years ago, and there's 95 priests out there who are suspected, and he knows, and he won't release the names. It's enabling.
Do you think this has been detrimental to the Catholic Church in terms of membership?
I think it's very sad. I think membership is already decreasing, and you can see that in the churches. And I'm a Catholic, Kate, and I, 12 years of parochial schools, and I go to church. I've seen a decrease in the numbers. Sermons like recently, when this crisis took hold, like "Are you a doubting Simon?" Projecting it onto the parishioners is not going to win over your flock. You're not going to get the support you want. So yes, I think it's made a sad impact. I think people are very discouraged. I feel that the bishop is trying to buy his time and wait this out so that way we can put the creche in front of the church and the 3 wise men and it all goes away. And I'm sorry, Bishop Tobin, but you failed. And we're not going to forget this.
And you talk about it going away, and you talk about the upcoming holiday season. Obviously, everyone from the bishop here up to the Pope in terms of what happened in Pittsburgh and who knew what and when. Do you think it really can go away anytime soon, or do you think this is going to continue? We're going to find out more, not just locally, but nationally and internationally?
I think we'll find out more nationally, internationally, and if the Pope keeps making statements like these victims sound like a bunch of wild dogs screaming, it's not helping, It's just, it distances Catholics from the church on every level.
Do you think that, we talk about the statute of limitations and especially from survivors needing that time to process and be an adult and come forth with this. Do we have enough resources for survivors here in Rhode Island?
I think the diocese needs to do more. I think they need to do more acknowledging what the situation is and the problems they have. And if they can't even do that, then no, we don't have enough resources to deal with survivors who come forward 20 years later as adults. And that I've worked in that field in social work and with victims of sexual assault and children, and I assure you it does take that time, and you do need the resources there. We don't have them yet.
So the call today, again, for Bishop Tobin to step down, coinciding with his fast, which was initially the day of penance, but now it's as he said, for just simply the victims of Pittsburgh. So what's next, Carolyn? You're incredibly active in the community. You had this event today. Do you have any sense of what you're going to do next?
We've been in touch with a national nonprofit survivor network of those abused by priests, 25,000 plus members in 60 different cities. They came and helped us some years back regarding Father Daniel Azarone, who when released from prison was given a job on the board of directors at Open Doors where he could oversee a vulnerable population of families. We interceded then. He was removed from his position. I called upon them again. So they are aware. They sent a press release out within 24 hours to Tobin. Ironically, it was the same day that later in the day he released that he was going to fast.
Don't think I knew that that was the precursor to the fast.
I have to wonder, but I'm pretty sure SNAP is very professional, well known, that they contacted the diocese asking for a statement from the diocese before they sent that press release out. And it's awful coincidental he decided, I'm going to fast by the end of day when that press release was coming out. We will be in contact. We are in contact with Survivor Network of those abused by priests. We're hoping possibly that they're going to take it to another level. I don't feel we're getting enough local media support. GoLocal Prov has been excellent. Channel 10 was there today, Channel 6. Channel 12 chose not even to come. And frankly, I would say they have propped up this bishop and supported him in a very negative way to the Catholics who are looking for some relief from this conflict. I believe SNAP may be offering some resources as we continue to work with them.
We have seen the bishop provide media opportunities in some instances here in Rhode Island and some not. We've consistently asked the diocese pertaining to the case especially of St. Joseph's and the pension fund there. So you're calling out certain media for both having and not asking the tough questions.
Yes, I am. Again, GoLocal Prov has been excellent. You've covered not just the sex abuse scandals, but the pension fraud and who's been involved and who's been an enabler involved with that. And it's been a huge disappointment to see how many have been victimized from both issues.
No, absolutely. We're going to continue to cover both issues. And Carolyn Medeiros, representing the Alliance for Safe Communities, but as you said, a broad coalition today there calling for Bishop Thomas Tobin to step down. Carolyn, I appreciate your taking the time to come in today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And this about just wraps up the day here in GoLocal, keeping an eye on Hurricane Florence, talking some local politics, and of course, talking about the Catholic Church here with Carolyn Medeiros. We wish everyone a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday on Business Monday with Josh Fenton. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.